So for this part of Jefferson's presidency, we're going to head into the West. And realistically, we're going to look at the one thing that people probably remember from Jefferson's time in office: the Louisiana Purchase and the subsequent Corps of Discovery led by Lewis and Clark. So all told, why does this purchase matter all that much? Now, France had regained Louisiana. Prior to the end of his first month in office, Jefferson started receiving reports that Spain had signed a treaty giving Louisiana back to Napoleon, the leader of France, and essentially Napoleon is strong-arming it. Jefferson isn't happy with this new French threat to the West because, Spain, if they control it, they're on the decline. They're not a huge issue. Napoleon, that's a whole other matter. However, if we fast forward a few years later, Napoleon is more than willing to sell the land because he needed money. He needs money to fund his war with England, and the success of the Haitian slave revolt on what's now the nation of Haiti in the Caribbean, this convinces him that holding on to his possessions in the Western Hemisphere, it's not good. All right, it's a bad idea. All of this is going to become abundantly clear to the incumbent U.S. Minister to France, a guy named Robert R. Livingston. All right, so he needs money for his war, can't keep his North American empire. Now, interestingly enough, by April 1803, Napoleon officially claims, "I renounce Louisiana." And Foreign Minister Talleyrand, who is the same individual involved with the XYZ affair, began to inquire as to whether the U.S. was interested in the entire territory and not just New Orleans. That's what we wanted. We simply wanted, first, the right to use New Orleans, maybe purchase it. And by this time, Livingston had been joined by James Monroe. And this special appointment from Jefferson was to initially purchase New Orleans. But the two of them began negotiating a treaty for all of it, all of New Orleans. It took about 2.5 weeks, and word reached Jefferson about 2 months later. He was stunned. In a good way, he was stunned, because you can see here, we get from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. Now, Jefferson had said, we want you to get New Orleans. Your budget is $10 million. We went $5 million over budget. $15 million for all of it. Shakes out to about 3 cents an acre, so good deal. Now, there are some legalities. Jefferson had to determine whether or not the purchase was legal because there was nothing in the Constitution that spelled out whether Congress had the authority to buy and add land to the U.S. He wanted the treaty ratified as quickly as possible, so he sped up the process. He had originally thought that a constitutional amendment might be required to make the purchase legal, and he actually had felt that he had already gone beyond what was legal for the executive branch to do with regards to treaties, because the Senate ratifies treaties. Ultimately, Jefferson's a realist, because remember, he's a theorist, but he combines it with the realities of his time, and he's willing to act. 1 month later, he received a report from France that they were growing very uncomfortable with the deal. The Senate ratified the treaty and doubled the size of the nation. So at the time of the purchase, the U.S. had about 334 million acres. So it more than doubled it. And you get a pretty good idea here of what the heck we're talking about. This was the United States. Here's the Mississippi River. And now, this is the United States. Although, technically, the western border is still a bit unclear. So we've got this land. We had made the purchase from France. The question now becomes, what's there? What do we do with it? That's where the Corps of Discovery comes into play. Now, Meriwether Lewis was the private secretary of Thomas Jefferson, and he had experience serving in the army. prior to the purchase of Louisiana. That's the important thing to understand. Before we bought Louisiana, Jefferson had appointed him as leader of an expedition that would find a route to the Pacific and lay the groundwork for U.S. claims to the region, because Britain was making us a little uncomfortable claiming that part of the Pacific Northwest was theirs. Congress secretly agreed to fund the expedition. Now, Jefferson got about $2,500 for the expedition, but it ended up costing about 15 times as much. Meriwether Lewis selected William Clark to join him for what was called the Corps of Volunteers for Northwest Discovery, but we just call it the Corps of Discovery. Now, the 50 men, most with military experience, that formed this corps had to wait east of the Mississippi River until official word of the purchase had arrived. They then set off on their expedition. And you can see here, they started in St. Louis, followed the Missouri River, through the Great Plains. They traversed the Snake and Columbia Rivers to the Pacific. Now, their journey is going to become public knowledge, and Americans were fascinated by accounts of this voyage. Jefferson began receiving artifacts from them in spring of 1805, and on December 3rd, 1805, the expedition staked their claim, so to speak. They staked their claim on a tree that was overlooking the Pacific Ocean, and this actually wasn't land that was part of the purchase. Sacagawea and her husband were hired as guides and translators because there were numerous tribes that the Corps of Discovery encountered, and Jefferson explicitly told them to treat whoever they encountered with kindness. Now, this staking of this claim, making it to the Pacific, it speaks to the idea that Jefferson believed the United States to be an empire of liberty, and that gaining land in the West would eventually help achieve that goal. This is where we really begin that vision of America going from Atlantic to Pacific, from sea to shining sea.